Hey everybody, welcome to the winter cycle of the Colloquium. Good to see old friends, colleagues. Thanks to Brett in Berlin, to Global Studies for hosting this, and thanks very much to Parag for joining us early morning in Singapore. Parag, what a good way to start this cycle. Parag Khanna, born in India, Kanpur, grew up in UAE, and comes with a very grounded sensibility of Greater Asia, which comes out in all of his books. And Parag, I think, seems like a modern day Ibn Battuta, voyaging, traveling across wide stretches with observations that are multidimensional that come out in all of his books. A sense of geopolitics that ranges from Sun Tzu to American Pentagon, Georgetown University, a British sense of critical political economy and geoeconomics, London School of Economics, a sense of politics and technology, business and finance. And the difference is that, I was just reading The Second World and his observations on Central America, on Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, very perceptive, evocative, and synthetic in sensibility. These are the kind of books that prompt you to open an atlas on the side to see exactly where is this. Different from Ibn Battuta is that Parag is also a futures thinker. He has an organization called Future Map. And mapping and time are two key variables in his work. Recent is an article in Time magazine, how we must adapt to climate change with new Manhattan projects, and an article in Foreign Policy about the 21st century doesn't belong to China, the United States, or Silicon Valley, but belongs to the internet. And now, because of the character of the platform with Parag, we adopt a format. Parag opens with a discussion of his recent work, Move, and then we move into a conversation a bit wider about his other books. Parag, very much welcome, very much thanks for joining us. Please, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jan. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you may be. I see a very globally distributed group, very appropriate to the subject matter. So it's a pleasure to join you. I think I was going to be in California today, but we decided to let Omicron chase us over the Pacific and back into this enclave, this fortress paradise that we live in here in Singapore. But I'm sure I'm somewhat familiar with all of the locations you're in. I'm looking forward to hearing your perspectives from wherever you may be as we get into the discussion. So thank you again, Jan, for that generous introduction. And it's a great way to kick off the year. I'll share some slides that will I'll try to be brief, just maybe 15 minutes if possible. But Jan and Brett, feel free to circulate these slides later on if anyone is interested in holding on to them for future reference. So let me just share my screen here. Okay, so I start out with this question, if you will, is mobility destiny, which was originally going to be the subtitle for this book, but let me place it in a bit of context. A lot of times human geography and migration are treated something as residual categories, topics within sub-dimensions of global studies or globalization, but not necessarily viewed as a lens for broader changes. And what I wanted to do is to put human geography, human mobility central, and explaining many other trends that are unfolding around the world, rather than viewing it simply as as one aspect of the globalization process, which it also is, but really one that is very, very central. And to make forecasts about its future, again, rather than simply observing it in a retrospective way. So we're all familiar with these aphorisms or axioms about the world. Is geography destiny? Some say demography is destiny. In a previous book, I talked about connectivity and infrastructure as a meta sort of historical trend, and again, a facet of the evolution of human civilization as we evolve and construct different categories of infrastructure, transportation, energy, communications, and what that tells us about systems change in world politics. And in this book, I'm asking, or concluding, if you will, the result of this is that mobility, so to speak, is destiny. Jan asked me to give a brief context to how I arrived at this point in my academic journey. And the Second World, which he just held up earlier, is I had a very nostalgic moment. Jan, that book is now, I guess I submitted the manuscript 15 years ago, so I'm feeling my bones get weary thinking about the backbreaking research. So that was my first travelogue. I did about 40 countries, a fairly excruciating travel. Indeed, the Central Asian republics, some of the places that are obviously in the news right now, Kazakhstan, over the course of 2004, 5, and 6, to do that book. And that was a book of political geography or geopolitics, but very centered around the shifting of borders and the operational mechanics of imperial forces, in particular, what we today simply refer to as the big three, the United States, the European Union, and China, each operating in their own way to extend their influence around the world on the sort of playing field of globalization. In particular, connectography, as I mentioned, was about global infrastructure and systems change, and how connectivity or the role of physical connectivity in geopolitics. And so that was a book of functional geography. And now, again, as I mentioned, we move into human geography. As Jan mentioned, of course, Asia is the geographic zone that winds up occupying a significant amount of space in all of these books. In maybe earlier in my writings, it was more from the standpoint of American foreign policy towards this geography. But then I took in the Asia book that intervenes a far more Asia-centric view of the world and talked about the Asian system, and used that very particular term from international relations theory about the definitions and characteristics of a geographical and institutional system. And that term had really not been applied formally to Asia outside of Sino-centric approaches. And so that's what I tried to do in that book. And that brings us to move. So let me dive in a bit. Now, as I say, I wanted to absolutely put human geography front and center. So this is page 2 of the book. I don't know if there's any text on page 1. So my point is to say that this is absolutely my central, sort of staging for the notion of human geography, and wanting to, again, not treat individual human beings, human life, human choices, behavior, movements at various scales as the central object of interest here. And human geography also to elevate that as a subdiscipline, to try and take this this interdisciplinary approach to explaining what drives our human geography historically, and as I say, to make forecasts about the future. And I liken it to climatology, right? Not just to migration. And this again is these are not interchangeable terms, right? Migration is simply one facet of a much broader question of human geography, which even includes our biological evolution and adaptation to new environments over time, past, present, and future. So human geography is an incredibly rich discipline. In America, it's an AP field, advanced placement field. It happens to be one of the fastest growing and is now one of the top 3 or top 4 selected APs in the entire country. So there's a good 250,000 American students who study human geography every single year. So putting it maybe just narrowly behind economics. So this is a fast growing area. I've engaged a lot with the American Geographical Society, which helps to structure the curriculum for the human geography AP. And this book is part of that curriculum now. So there's a whole study guide. There's hundreds of maps, actually far more than went into the book, that we've put in a study guide. So if any of you are teaching human geography at that crossover level, let me know, and we'll get you that study guide as well. Let me move down. So let's talk about not just human geography, but again, the context of geographies. And what I have, one of my points of departure in this book is to point to the need to reconcile 4 different layers of geography. And when people speak of geography, they often mean one or the other of the following 4, but not all at the same time in an attempt to reconcile them. And yet, to me, that is exactly what the central challenge of the global order is today, institutionally, is to find ways to reconcile these 4 layers of geography. The first being natural geography, which is itself, you might say, internally very dynamic as a result of, always, but most certainly today as a result of climate change, in which we have shifting geophysical characteristics of the world that are constantly changing this map. Maps of geography, maps of natural geography, physical geography are very often treated as static, right? We take the environment as a given. Of course, we can no longer do that. It's being affected by so many human-centric, industrial, and other sorts of forces. The second layer of geography is a political geography, where it's loading a bit slowly. Oops, I skipped over. Here we go. So this is the map that most classrooms and offices have hanging on their wall, some variant of this depiction of our bordered world. And let me say at the outset that this was one of my motivations, now not from an analytical, but almost a normative standpoint. And in all of my books, is to really challenge the idea that this is the de facto map of the world. For one thing, as everyone knows, it's quite arbitrary. It's arbitrary that we live in a world contingent of contingent nation states at the moment, such as we do. So in a very big picture sense, in a deep ontological sense, it's very arbitrary. But also, of course, these borders are shifting all the time, and it's also the map is also a consequence of climatological factors from the previous map. And it's also shaped by other forces as well. So as I was just referencing, my work with high schools and students, I've always found it rather lamentable that we raise children. If you think about it, you could walk into a kindergarten around the world, and to the extent that they have a map of the world, it probably is a political map. So we have literally indoctrinated, inculcated, brainwashed the children of the world, and we've been doing it for generations, to believe that this is the natural map of the world, natural in quotes, rather than the actual natural map of the world. And I find this, downright not just regrettable, I find it heinous. And so, I've made this a cause, not just with this book, but really going back the last 5-10 years, to try to shift through cartography the lens through which we condition people to view the world, and not to view this as the default organization of the human species. The third layer is functional geography, and it's with connectography that I began to make that cartographic mission much more concrete. Began working with the Center for Geographical Analysis at Harvard, which is kind of at the cutting edge of GIS tools to produce maps, very accurate maps of global infrastructure and other phenomenon, and to elevate functional geography and say, well, this is the map that we, through our own volition, are building every single year. We spend, about $3 trillion on infrastructure every single year, which is far more than all the defense budgets and border control agencies in the world put together. We spend a lot more on infrastructure and on connectivity broadly understood than we do on division and borders and militaries, but not a single map that hangs in any of your classrooms or in any office around the world is this map, is this depiction of that which we are doing every single day to reorganize ourselves and to build the infrastructure and supply chains that underpin global globalization, and global interactions more broadly, and globalization itself. So this is the type of map that I seek to put, front and center. And then, of course, the fourth layer of geography is us, as I said on page 2, of the book. It's human geography. And of course, this also lends entirely new perspectives, to how we view the world. And of course, this is part of what brought me to focusing on Asia, is the sheer demographics, a world in which more than 50% of the human population lives in the broader Asian geography. The revelatory nature of understanding where we live as a result, of course, of climatic factors, right? Where the climate allows us to live is where we live. And from a long-term standpoint, we have thrived in that latitudinal climate niche of mostly 20 to 30 degrees north latitude as the optimal band for human settlement, obviously coastal and littoral areas, and so on and so forth. And again, we tend to not view the world in this way sufficiently. But again, my fundamental mission was to reconcile these geographies and to look at the mismatches among them, and to posit that so many of our problems in the world today and many of the solutions result from the misalignment and the need to realign these layers. And as I state, to take just the biggest examples, we have pressing labor shortages in the countries that are most rapidly depopulating. So that's human geography and functional geography. And we have areas that are forecasted to be beneficiaries of climate change, or at least the least negatively impacted by climate change, depopulating as well, while the majority of the human population lives in climate stressed areas. And that's what I'm going to show you right now. If you just squint your eyes and focus for the next 5 seconds, there's an animation I want you to see. So we started out with the distribution of the human population. There were 8 billion pixels on this map. I'll go back again. So here we are with the human geography. So, the present distribution of the world population. And now you move forward in time and you look at the NOAA, IPCC, NASA forecasts around what is called the suitability change. And red obviously means places that are becoming less suitable to human habitation with each degree of temperature rise, green becoming more suitable than they previously were. Again, it's a relative scale. And again, if you superimpose this on the previous map, what you see is people are in the wrong places, certainly not through their own fault. But what are we going to do to reconcile these geographies? And is there going to be a new human geography emerging as a result of climate change, among other drivers in the years ahead? It seems fairly obvious that if we live where we do, because that is what the climate has allowed over the last 12,000 years since the retreat of the last ice age, what does the future hold for our human geography? And are we going to cling to today's distributional kind of patterns, or are they going to change? Well, obviously they're going to change, but we tend to not think about how. So I've been doing a fair bit of writing, derivative of this book, and looking, just taking advantage of the COP26 moment and agenda, and pointing out that climate migration are 2 words that you barely hear at the same time in a COP process. Why? Well, I think all of you on this call will appreciate the answer as much as I do. And there's one single word to answer it, that's sovereignty. When sovereign governments get together, the last thing that they will ever discuss or that they will ever agree to is free mobility for people. Because in a world of globalization and global processes and violations of sovereignty, voluntary and involuntary, it could well be that the very last vestige of sovereignty that governments hold on to in an age where they're losing monetary sovereignty and can't control the flow of pathogens or cyber attacks across their borders, the one thing left when all else has been converged upwards, if you will, or devolved downwards, is the control over one's borders against the movement of human beings. And so whether it's Glasgow or Cancun or Copenhagen or you name the summit, you'll really never have a global migration agreement. You'll have many efforts towards it. There will be plenty of statements of the United Nations. Even the COP26 summit ended with a call for greater focus on climate adaptation and greater investment of resources in climate adaptation. But climate migration, no way, right? Will literally never happen. Even the most cosmopolitan utopian among us could not believe that the cynical process of international relations would agree to any kind of collective migration accord. As I say, we're going to have ever larger scale population movements owing to climate change. Already it accounts for a larger share of internally displaced people than political forces, political violence, civil wars, or international conflicts. So what I sought to do is to speculate in this book around the destination geographies of mass climate migrations and plot them on the map and talk about the capacity of certain societies to absorb those migrants and what it means, obviously, for political stability, for the demographic and ethnographic composition of societies, the politics, and so forth. Here is a data point I mentioned. One of the things I look at from the historical standpoint is not only the sheer number of migrants in the world in each of the past centuries, but the fundamental driving forces of those migrations. And if you go back, let's say, roughly to the colonial and post-colonial centuries, or the colonial centuries, starting with the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, you find that generally speaking, the number of migrants, the migrant stock and flow in the world has expanded significantly, from millions to tens of millions in the 18th century, hundreds of millions of migrants in the 19th century. And as many forecast in this century, there could be well over 1 billion migrants. And the drivers of migration have tended to be a mix of political and economic. It could be the transatlantic slave trade. It could be migrations within colonial realms like the British Empire. Obviously, it could be famines. It could be the discovery of the New World and America as a destination for European settlers and migrant populations from Ireland to Italy. Obviously, it's political phenomena like the partition of India and decolonization. So what I do is just to take the kind of milestones, obviously World War II as well, and the expulsion of populations, as well, also the collapse of empires in World War I as well. So you've had a mix of economic and political phenomena driving, and of course, these are very, very difficult to disentangle, and I make only a minimal effort to do so. I have different charts where I plot out the major events, but I don't pretend that these are neatly sort of divisible into pure economic drivers like the search for economic opportunity versus political forces. They very often go hand in hand, bearing in mind that, in the 20th century, for example, the migration of Turks and other populations into Europe, or Latinos and Asians in the United States, was actually largely, a combination of labor shortages and search for economic opportunity. But anyway, here in the 21st century, we already have a significant proportion of the total, sort of new migrant stock in the world driven by climatological phenomena, and this proportion, will surely grow over time, and as will the raw number. Now, of course, the world population quadrupled over the course up. Sorry, let me just go back. Again, we'll share these slides, but again, as I mentioned, what I do is go back hundreds of years and characterize the largest migrant flows into economic, political, colonial related, and now climate. You see how climate has emerged here. And as I mentioned just before, the 1951 Refugee Convention, which is one of the still standing statements on migration and migrant rights, doesn't cover climate migrants. So we already have a lot of novel legal cases emerging around the rights of climate migrants and how they're treated. And because this convention doesn't cover them, there's a lot of legal precedent that is being set. Well, anyway, what I do is, when I'm bringing us up to the contemporary kind of period now, I look at these 5 forces: demographic imbalances, which are more acute than ever, which is to say the gap between young and old within and across countries, and the labor shortages emerging from them; political upheaval, whether it is domestic, again, state failure, or whether it is international conflict, has always been a driver of migration, of course. It's Syria, Afghanistan, Arab Spring and so forth. Economic dislocation, the movement of peoples as a result of financial crises. If you look at deindustrialization in the United States and the Rust Belt, that was a driver of people moving north to south. The financial crisis at the same time pushed a number of Southern Europeans to the north. So economic forces are always significant. Technological disruptions, that again cuts two ways. It could be the labor automation that I mentioned earlier. In previous books, I've looked at Southern Chinese factory workers and their shifts as a result of factory closures owing to the demand shock of the 2008 financial crisis. But it also cuts in what you might call a positive way, which is that many of us, of course, are working from home. We're not working in the city of our employer due to technology as well, and our ability to Zoom, and so forth. And many people have been positing that during this lockdown, that's going to be one of the drivers of future, again, demographic decisions for the swath of the world population that is capable of remote work, that is technically what's known as location independent work. So, a services economy kind of work, and that's a growing share of the global workforce, according to the IBC. And then, of course, climate change, which is the original driver of human migration, and obviously becoming the largest driver again today. So you take all of these together, because you can't neatly separate these factors or crises, and you multiply it, if you will. I don't literally mean multiply, but again, the power of connectivity, the infrastructure that we've been building, enables greater mobility. And many of the infrastructures that were built for one purpose wind up getting used, as a migrant pathway. Look, of course, at trains and railways, in Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and so on. So that leads to accelerated mobility, and it's a very paradoxical time to be making this claim given the global lockdown. But if you think about, again, how acute each of these drivers is becoming, and then, it becomes obviously impossible to pretend that the mere sort of fact of this temporary global lockdown would put a brake on what has been an enormous expansion of international migration in recent decades. So I do think that we will resume that previous pattern of expanded migration as a result of all of these driving forces, individually and in combination, and that will result in, and again, ever larger numbers of people on the move, so to speak. And so this lockdown really was, again, temporary. But where does it take us, right? What does the future hold? What are the, again, scenarios? So a lot of the book, explores these four scenarios that I flesh out in some detail in the book, because of course we can't really know precisely where the future lies. But three of these four scenarios that I've constructed along the axes of sustainability and volume of migration are not particularly positive by any means. And let me say that all four of these are already true today. They're already visible. The art of scenario planning lies in taking signals that are present, evidence that is present today, and extrapolating from that. So we already live in a world of regional fortresses in which migration is severely restricted by countries of the North, at the national or regional level, North America, Europe, Northeast Asia, and in which they invest more in their own sustainability than in technology transfer to those places that would benefit from it. We already live in the so-called new Middle Ages kind of scenario as well, in which many people are becoming, scrambling climate migrants as a result of localized, climate events, without the ability to rebuild their lives in more stable environments. And where there's insufficient investment in climate-related adaptation. We already live in a barbarians at the gate scenario. Apologies, of course, for the terminology, which is, is a checkered but long history, in which you could, of course, can see the uncontrolled migrant flows in the U.S.-Mexico border or across the Mediterranean and in other geographies of the world, coupled with what I bring in that scenario is the land grabs, the resource competition, potential water wars, and these kinds of things. And we already live in a Northern Lights scenario where there is, in fact, a new complexion to livable habitats as a result of gradual migration processes. And Canada is an example of a country that sits, front and center, or a case study in that. And to some degree, much lesser degree, Russia as well, and Northern Europe in general. So all of these scenarios are in fact true today. The question is, to what degree will each of these scenarios manifest in the different geographies of the world with each passing decade? And that forms the better part of the book, is this kind of just future casting through the lens of these scenarios, filtered through geography, with one, sort of, again, point that I was just about to make earlier, which is that through the lens of our global demographic plateau and decline. Because demographic studies, which is of course some component of human geography, demographic forecasting over the past 25 years has tended to project a high-end scenario for not some would fall into a Malthusian branch of that analysis, suggesting that not only is the world population headed towards 12 billion, 13 billion plus, which is what some of the forecasts were in the up through the 2000s. But that, of course, that is going to bring about certain, Malthusian kinds of scenarios. But with each passing year, our forecasts have bent the curve significantly downward. And that's well justified, because fertility has been collapsing, urbanization, female empowerment, education, economic stress, and now climate consciousness are all factors that have rapidly brought down fertility everywhere in the world, including in China, India, Africa, and elsewhere. So every time we go through this exercise of demographic forecasting, we make significant downward corrections in our projections of the global population. And what I do in this book is I kind of push the envelope there, and I further correct downward from the 2019 forecasts that were done by the Gates Foundation and the University of Washington. They put the final sort of peak humanity, as I call it, at about 11 billion people. I think they're wildly off the mark there too. I think even 10 billion is too high. And now, since those forecasts were made before the pandemic, I'm sure you've all been hearing about the baby bust. And the baby bust that's underway right now is actually far more severe than the 2008 baby bust. Now, let me make a couple of points here. It's bad enough to have had 2 baby busts in such a short period of time. It's relatively unprecedented to have such severe contractions in global fertility twice in a 10-year period. Let me also point out that the pandemic baby bust that is still ongoing is substantially more severe than the global financial crisis baby bust. And therefore, as a result, not only is the global population going to be very clearly measurably affected by this, but that we're actually reaching the inflection point towards this peak humanity far sooner than anyone had expected. It won't be 2060, or whatever. It's more likely to come in the 2030s. Already, what we can say with some confidence is that Generation Z, which is today's, or rather Generation Alpha, which is today's toddlers, still not fully born, will be smaller than Generation Z. So if you have a Generation Z, a teenage, sort of child, they belong to the largest single generational cohort that the human species has ever produced and will ever produce. And it literally does go downhill from there. And with accelerating baby boomer mortality, which is projected to pick up towards the end of this decade and into the 2030s, you will actually have a significant downward correction in the global population beginning relatively soon. So this is a really novel situation, because none of us have lived at a time when the human population was not exponentially increasing from 2 billion people 100 years ago to 8 billion people today. The curve has been very, very steep. And now suddenly that is coming to a crashing halt. So I elevate this issue here as a background condition, because the question of the future human geography is not a question of managing an ever expanding demographic. And therefore, we need a new psychology around this issue, because we're really just talking about 9 billion souls, 9 billion, human beings is all. That's it. It's actually not a very large number, especially since a lot of them are in, let's say in China, in India, in Africa. The fact is that if you live in Europe, or if you live in North America, if you live in an OECD country, you're already at peak humanity. You're already in a depopulating country, if not for migration. And the most recent census data in the United States makes this abundantly clear. In fact, it was the headline news in America just a couple of weeks ago, was that America's population is growing at the slowest rate in centuries, literally since the 1780s. Europe, of course, you already know, is well past peak humanity, absent immigration. And we know this now that China's most recent census provided a significant downward correction of its current population, and even India, is very, very low fertility at this point. So you have the dependency ratios, you have the labor shortages, you have the gap between young and old geographically. Again, these mismatches. So does it suggest potentially that we're going to have a shift in our psychological attitudes towards migration, given those background conditions? One of the other things I do in this book is I mentioned that Generation Alpha is going to be smaller than Generation Z. Generation Y and Generation Z, the millennials and Gen Z together form the two largest generations in the world, which is to say the world is still more young than it is old. We often talk about a world that's aging, but in fact, the majority of the human population is under the age of 40, and mostly in developing countries. And what I wanted to do here is just to point out, and I think that this message will receive some sympathy, in this audience. When people use the phrase, the pronoun we, we speak about we as if we can generalize from our position about what are the common attributes, psychological or geographic or cultural, in the sense of Frederick Jameson's weird, right? Western educated, industrial, and so on, democracies. The truth is that the median human being in the world is not a Western citizen in a 2-income household, a husband and wife with 2 children living in a suburb. That is not we. And the median human being is actually more like this. It's young. It's someone who's single, unmarried, and perhaps not likely to get married, childless, because our children are not having children. There's nothing we can do about it. They're economically struggling, and they live in some, teeming, developing world city. That's a normal human being in the world today. So I presume not a single person, no one on this call, we maybe can potentially sympathize with that predicament, but that doesn't describe any of us. So I don't think that we're in any place to talk about who we are as humans. So what I try to do in this book is put myself in the shoes of who a typical human being is today. It happens to be the subject that I've often explored in my travels, because the people who I quote unquote hang out with when I'm not interviewing officials and academics is these kids on the street. These are the people who've been my fixers. When I go to Libya, or I go to Colombia, or I go to Uzbekistan, this is the demographic I've been hanging out with for the last 20 years. It is the young, struggling, childless, sort of urban youth. And that is actually the largest demographic in the world today as a community, is just urban youth, single urban youth. So I wanted to kind of explore the future from their perspective, and that's obviously well justified, because we'll all be dead. And therefore, if you want to write a book about the future of human geography, you have to look at the behaviors, the attitudes, the psychology, the movements of today's young people. So I put at the center of this analysis a typical 20 to 30-year-old person, or a typical teenager today in the year 2021, 2022, and ask, well, where are they going to be in the year 2030, 2040, 2050, and why? How did they get there? What drove them there? What places welcomed them? What places rejected them? What types of communities are emergent? We have a lot of survey research around young people, qualitative research that talks about youth values, and three kind of signals emerge from that. Connectivity is a virtue for them. Sustainability is a priority for them. Mobility is viewed as a right, for them. And one of the things I point out in the book is that this is the first time where we can survey so many people, or just look at the Facebook metadata and suggests that young people have more in common psychologically with each other horizontally than they do vertically with their own countrymen across generations. Now, I'm going to jump ahead because I've been speaking a bit too long here, but I go into some of this, sort of survey data and how it clashes with the ideas of nationalism and national identity as the kind of foundation of identity. When you look at again, the psychology of young, what it tells us about, again, today's I characterize as relatively temporary blip of xenophobic populist nationalism in the face of the economic necessity of greater migration in the name of fiscal stability in northern countries. And I use certain issues as a lens to explain it, like military conscription policy and the evasion of conscription by young people in all countries that have conscription, and how nationalism tends to be a driver of emigration. So, we have this notion of civilizational states in the geopolitical literature today. But the funny thing is, we talk about these countries as if they're a harbinger of things to come, as if these strongman regimes are the wave of the future. But we often forget to point out that these are the same countries that people are leaving. No one wants to live in Turkey or Russia or even India to some degree. So why do we, if we use the lens of human geography and migration to evaluate the strength of these civilizational states, we would point out that they are actually rather brittle if you look at their demographics and the relationship between nationalism and migration, and so on and so on. And then, of course, I look at Western countries that buck the trend of this notion of a wave of populism, and I highlight in particular Canada and Germany, whereas you see in the news all the time Canada being pound for pound the most generous country in the world in terms of inward migration, 400,000 people per year, increasing its population by 1% a year. Germany being the only country in Europe with a growing population and labor force as a result of net inward migration. And the fact that they've managed to beat back the far right populist parties. So there's a lot that one can say about this. And I get into, some, again, the normative and policy cases for how to go about thinking about, welcoming greater migrants and assimilation policies. Let me close on the big picture points again around the largest geographical vectors of human migration in the future, owing to a combination of these forces. Over the last 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've settled into relatively stable regional clusters and regional patterns of migration. Asians within Asia, people of the former Soviet republics migrating within that zone. The largest inter-regional or transnational flow has been, of course, South Asians in the Gulf countries, Latinos in North America, and so on. What I do in the book is to particularly focus on two very large emergent and future trends, and they both emerge from Asia, from South and East Asia, which is where you have the highest concentration of young people who are willing and able to migrate. And the first is simply from south to north. It's from South Asia and Southeast Asia into North Asia, which means Central Asia and Russia, former Soviet Union more broadly. And there's a lot of anecdotal data, evidence of that I talk about in the book from my own travels in the Caucasus, Central Asia and Russia and so forth, whether it's farmers or doctors or other roles or construction workers. And I call this the reverse Mogul Empire. So those of us who hail from the subcontinent will find this humorous. Obviously, so you take the 500 years ago, the Mughal Empire emerged as a result of the Central Asian populations moving southward. Now what you have is South Asian populations moving northward, owing largely to climate change and labor market demand. The second vector that I look at is what I call Asian Europeans. Now, I grew up as an Asian American. I migrated to the United States when I was 6 and grew up, and I was in that category of hyphenated migrants known as Asian Americans. There are today more than 20 million Asian Americans. The Vice President of the United States is a half Asian American, but you don't have Asian Europeans. There's only 4 million people of Asian extraction who live within the European Union. I've bracketed out Great Britain, not only because it's not in the EU anymore, but obviously because it has a much larger legacy of post-colonial Asian migrations and a large Asian population. So in all of Western Europe, you have only 4 million Asians. whereas you have more than 25 million on the opposite side of the world across the Pacific Ocean from Asia. That's going to shift as a result of the demographic imbalances, the trade routes and connectivity, the sort of the new Silk Roads, if you will, and the growing economic ties between Asia and Europe. So I look at the growing number of Asian Europeans as a way for European countries to, again, continue in a piecemeal way to bridge their labor shortages, but also as a new demographic in addition to Arabs, Africans, and others that are already located in Europe, and what that is going to mean for European kind of demographics, politics, and social arrangements. Let me just wrap up here, which can get us into debate. When we talk about mass migration today, whatever the cause, a lot of people recoil in horror. They say, my goodness, this is going to, trample the world, and how will we ever, adapt to this? And, we're not ready for a world of mass migrations. And I point out that actually, mobility has always been intrinsic to human nature. We are a nomadic species. In fact, over the past 100,000 years of history, we've been mostly nomadic. And in the past several centuries, the 19th century, which is often characterized as an age of nationalism, was also a century of mass migration. So these forces are not necessarily opposing. In fact, one is a driver of the other. And I point out that more broadly, things that we have proven to be not particularly successful at managing as a collective society are maintaining stability geopolitically, maintaining economic equality, and being stewards of the environment. But we've been fantastically good in the last several centuries at absorbing mass migrations. I dare say it's what we're best at in this world, because it's actually the thing that's most intrinsic to being human, is the capacity, the anatomical capacity for mobility, and building infrastructure and using it to move, whether it's voluntary or involuntary. So I want to reframe the psychology around this notion of becoming mass migrations, which is viewed as something that is a destabilizing force, because yes, it can be, but it doesn't have to be, because we've actually proven to be very, very good at it. And of course, the most successful societies in the world today, and to some extent, with certain exceptions, are places that have been welcoming to migrants, at least in the kind of, let's say, contemporary narrative prior to sort of Chinese exceptionalism in this particular regard. But so I wanted to kind of close on a positive note. And then the final point, just circling back to a layering of cartographies, because this is really, again, part of what motivated me, is to take the layers of geography and to put them all into one map, and to say that this is an accurate representation of, quote unquote, how the world works. You want to understand the complex dynamics of the world today and take complexity seriously. You can't look only at international relations and interstate relations. You can't look only at functional geography. You can't look only at environmental geography. You can't look only at human geography. You have to look at all of them at the same time. And it is the interactions among these levels and layers that generate the complexity that we feel vulnerable to, or that we observe every single day in the world, and that we have to start to take seriously this cartographic complexity in order to untangle some of these processes and to make forecasts about how they'll play out, and ideally, of course, to come up with certain solutions. So I try my hand at some of those solutions, and I say, of course, in the end, geography is and destiny is what we make of it. But we have, the agenda that I conclude the book with is either moving people to resources or moving technologies to people, thinking about mobility as a human right and finding ways to divorce it from nationality. Of course, the prison, if you will, the prison of the passport, the contingency of one's geography of birth, and to evolve beyond sovereignty to what I called in the previous slide, programmable geography, or simply stewardship, and to realign these layers of geography. And as we do so, as people do relocate, to use the technologies that are available today to do so in a sustainable fashion, and so on and so on. So I'll just stop right there. And thank you again for your time, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thanks, Parag. Thank you very much. This isn't bad for 4 a.m. in the morning, Parag. This is a bit up tempo. So just some quick notes. One, I'm speaking as a Eurasian. Second, description of globalization is we are all migrants. And a description of the new globalization is we will all be migrants. We are migrating again. Now, the situation says climate change, migrate, and many other signals say do not migrate. And you point out various ironies and contradictions there. Demographic decline has been, of all the pattern breaks, the biggest major pattern breaks in history. So this is a key point you rightly highlight. Now, just one remark to try and combine your work. Your work is a layering of maps. It's always grounded in geography, different kinds of geography, and as it were, each book combines a different geography with a grand theme. And the theme is politics in second world. The theme is infrastructure, in connectography, in technology, in another book, and in the future is Asian. The future, the grand theme is Asia. How, and now the grand theme is climate, right? How does the future is Asian combine with, interact with your new move book?
Right.
Is Asia moving north into Siberia? And then we think of the circumstance that drought in Central Asia, in what that is now caused this mass migration from the steppes of between the Black Sea and the Urals, so that half the so-called Europeans are actually Asians in the old times, right? Is this a reconnection, a remigration? How do you view this? And is it
Absolutely.
true, by the way, Parag, that your Future is Asian book, one of the hallmarks, intriguing hallmarks, is that it is not China-centric. And this remains valid for your current approach. Here's a question just to start, please.
I mean, ever more so from a demographic standpoint, because of course India's population is effectively now, at the same level as China's, and certainly a far younger median age. Indians will have, and South Asians in general, of which there's a combined 1.8 billion, will have a far higher propensity to outward migration than Chinese do. The Chinese diaspora, which is currently still larger than India's diaspora, is still mostly concentrated in the Pacific, whereas the Indian diaspora is truly global and far flung. 20 million in just the Gulf countries alone. And so in the further we look into the future, the more we'll see that the Indian diaspora will actually eclipse the Chinese diaspora in size and scale. And of course, there's geopolitical factors, economic factors, and so forth, and linguistic as well, that will play a role in what I call cheekily the future being brown in many ways. That is the way Asia is headed. It's also the way the world is headed in terms of complexion. In terms of Asia as a geography, you do see in the last 30 years, again, these system-like characteristics. You have a lot more Asian mobility within Asia. Let's remember that Asians travel and study far more in other Asian countries than they do in terms of coming out. So, I mean, you teach in the University of California system, which has lots of Asian students. Remember that Asians are more than 3 times as likely to stay in Asia, but across the border in Asia, than to be able to afford to make their way across the Pacific to the United States. So Asia is becoming more Asian despite the geopolitical tensions. You just had the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership go into effect last week. It's the largest trade agreement on the planet, and ratified at the height of this pandemic. So, and of course, amidst lockdowns and so forth, Asians are more likely to stay in their own region. But within that, right? New vectors, Asians increasingly coming to Southeast Asia, going to the Gulf, becoming more Eurasian in the sense of making their way all the way to Europe. Definitely the rising populations of Indians and South Asians in Central Asia and Russia, all of those. The further you look into the future, the more you have something of a recreation. And this is you mentioned the sort of the Central Asian drought of millennia ago. I go back about 30,000 years to the collision of proto-humans in the Central Asian steppe, which led to the birth of the Indo-European language family and a very significant amount of genetic mingling. And you can see this in maps of, sort of maps that we have from the archaeological record that identify those geographies of significant Asian genetic interactions. And I do posit that that's kind of where we're heading back to, is this, Asian mingling, Asian intermarriage, of course, but Asians intermarrying and mingling with Western populations as well. So yeah, Asia remains central because, again, it represents the majority of the human population, and it always will represent the majority of the human population, especially amidst the collective decline, because Asia not only has more people, but it still has far more young people than the entire rest of the world. So if there's a two-word answer to who are the future humans, the answer is actually Asian youth. Today's Asian youth become an ever larger share of humanity's population every year into the future. So where they go is the answer to the question of our future human geography.
One quick question, then open floor, please, Parag. Does this move of Asians also include Russia? With a note, Russia is becoming more climate hospitable, Siberia, West Siberia, etc., but politically inhospitable, unlike Canada, but because it has such a fortress approach.
Right.
How does that work for you?
Well, so, the on-the-ground picture of Russian demographics is quite different from its political character. So if you take Vladimir Putin at his word, then you would think of Russia as a politically inhospitable, culturally, unadaptable, very rigid, xenophobic place. The reality on the ground, as I report directly firsthand, in the book and in this, particularly in the National Geographic essay, where I was able to bring in some more material, is that those individuals who are charged with actually governing Russia are mostly pro-migration, because they, on the one hand, have to bring about or engineer all of these schemes of economic modernization and infrastructural revitalization and taking advantage of the agricultural opportunity, Russia now being the world's largest wheat exporter, and they don't have the people to do it. So you have Chinese investment in railways and pipelines, and you have and so forth. But you don't have enough farmers, you don't have enough factory workers, you don't have enough construction workers. So Russians who actually have to do these things, which is to say governors, mayors, administrators, technocrats, they're largely, in my conversations, quite pro migration, if you will. And so I do think that you will have a controlled, if you will, increase in migration into Russia that is effectively inevitable, because Russia has really one of the worst demographics in the entire world in terms of depopulation as a percentage of its own population, mortality, and so on and so on. So Russia is not yet the Eurasian Canada. It will never be the Eurasian Canada. There's not going to be a Justin Trudeau of Canada as a successor to Putin. But that said, you will see a gradual shift towards grudgingly recognizing and developing the frameworks around temporary migrants become permanent migrants. And this is what Japan has learned. Japan just passed some new laws that are, granting permanent residency to even low income earning foreign workers that are semi-skilled. So, Nepalese people are getting permanent residency in Japan. That's not something you would have imagined a couple of years ago.
That is a turning point. Yes. Marvelous. Please open the floor. Colleagues, friends, who wants to step in here? David, Marcus, and then David, please.
Thank you so much, Parag, for this wonderful presentation, sparkling with visual insights, and also a refreshing optimism that we are, yes, so good in actually accommodating migration. And I'm also really sympathetic to your suggestion, bribe the naysayers, bribe those xenophobes to give them a stake in the bonanza and the benefits of immigration. But what makes me worry is about why hasn't that happened already? What are the factors that have so far so strongly prevented this kind of bribing of the xenophobes? Why do right-wing populists in France, Le Pen, Zemmour, Trump in the United States, and I could name a lot of other countries in the North Atlantic region that I'm familiar with, where those political entrepreneurs on the right seem to flourish by scapegoating the migrants. So how did that fail up to date? And what would then justify the optimism that at some point in the future it would then work out? Would that then lose the force? Is there some inbuilt mechanism, or is it simply a principle of hope based on agency, on insight? How could we envision that?
It's a great question. So I think it would take too long to list all of the factors that have prevented us from proactively compensating the so-called losers from globalization or migration and addressing all of their cultural sensitivities. And of course, if you wanted to characterize the failure, you would obviously say, well, populist politics, democratic populist politics has been a more immediately present and powerful force than far-sighted demographic planning and technocratic vision around labor force integration of migrants and so forth. So the fact is a failure of governance, is simply put. Also, though, let's point out that the countries that we highlight as those that are anti-immigrant or that don't have a sensible policy towards in migration and assimilation, such as France, such as Italy, these are hardly role models. Let me be perfectly blunt. And I think part of what will induce the change more broadly is countries looking at Germany, countries looking at Canada and saying, wait, I don't want to be like Italy. I don't want to be like France. I don't want to be in demographic and economic decline with the stagnant population fighting over the kind of the scraps of what remains in a stagnant economy. I want to be a flourishing, thriving, expanding economy in a dynamic cultural landscape, like Germany is today, like Canada is becoming today. And so I think that role model effect, that signaling effect. Now, if I were to do a Google search of the number of hits for the name Viktor Orban over the last 5 years, and compare that with the number of Google hits for Justin Trudeau, you would find that Viktor Orban, this utterly irrelevant peripheral figure from a very small, Central European country, gets an outsized degree of attention in Western consciousness, as compared with a country that is countless times larger, literally, as well as more significant to the world, which is Canada, and what it's doing in emergence. So we have this bias, of course, towards negativity, bad news, and so on. But I do think that, again, who wants to be like Hungary? Who wants to be like Italy? Absolutely no one. And the demonstration effects, whether you're talking about immigration policy or whether you're talking about economic reforms and countries joining trade agreements, demonstration effects are by far the most powerful conditioning factor or one of the most powerful factors in political and policy change, because countries, leaders realize, I want to be like that. I want to copy that, and sometimes it's in resistance to domestic factors, and sometimes they're sort of pushing on an open door. So it varies country by country, but there will be more bribing of naysayers, but less need to bribe naysayers, because again, look at the demographics. The far right demographic is elderly. the Brexit voters are older, right? The AFD voters are older, and this kind of thing. So I view this in a way as organically happening anyway. But I do think that it would be smart to do so in a strategic, proactive, future-oriented way. And I strongly support far greater social spending on assimilation policy, whether it's language, whether it's skills training, whether it is, sort of just promoting national civic identity through national service. I spend a fair bit of time on that in the book and characterizing countries according to those that have those strong assimilation practices versus those that don't.
David, please.
Gotta love maps.
Matthias.
Yeah, thanks so much. Marcus, great question too. Prague, wow, gotta love maps. It's really amazing. And thank you so much for getting up so early for us.
And not at all.
You've given such a wonderful, hopeful spin to a lot of this. And those of us who have lived many years in Asia kind of expected this, that this was going to be happening anyway. I'm wondering about the roles of media, social media, AI and so forth going forward. It sort of touches on what Marcus was just asking about. And also, I view this country, United States, as really dangerous for the rest of the world, and would be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
So a couple of things in terms of technology and social media. I think, and we've tended to characterize it in a one-dimensional way, which is to, kind of through the presentism of fake news and, misinformation and this kind of thing. But the most fundamental role that communications technology, in my view, is played in the area of migration, not just communications technology, but also financial technologies, has been positive because it's enabled diaspora communities to remain connected, and it's created entire gigantic economic ecosystems of diasporic contributions to their economy. So if you look at the Philippines, Mexico, India, and just look at the rise of, again, fintech and micropayments and, cryptocurrencies and so forth, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of added capital flows within ethnographic groups, diaspora. So I think that's extremely important. The second is the way in which it's facilitated chain migration. I mean, part of the reason that you have ever more Asians coming to the United States is precisely because they've stayed connected, they understand better what's happening, and then you have migration biases towards chain migration and family migration. So you have, migration begets more migration, and technology actually plays a role in that, in the communications factor, and people kind of saying, let's stay in touch and let's move people over, and let's use, again, various, technological platforms to create these professional and other sorts of communities. So that's generally positive. And then there's the role of technology, again, in enabling remote work, right? Which again applies to hundreds of millions of people already, and even more in the future. All of those are technology, right? AI is going to displace a lot of people for sure from their present work, and it also displaces them potentially from their capacity to be able to afford to live in the geographies they've been in. So, I can cite examples have been displaced from financial services and publishing who lived in Midtown Manhattan and can't afford that anymore. So they moved to Vermont, or something like that. And that's happening all over the world. So there's just so many aspects of this, and this sort of, fake news and filter bubbles and all that's just one dimension of it that's very dynamic and ever changing. In terms of the US, and if we look at the demographics of the United States, in 20 years' time, we will for sure look back and say, Trump who? Turns out he was just a blip, right? Because we've already gone back to significant expansion of migrational preferences and policy. Yesterday, in fact, some data was released that the number of H-1B visa applicants and approvals has shot up again. And the speed at which H-1B visas are being approved is at record levels now. So actually, the Biden administration is fixing the system in the guts, in the bureaucratic guts, digitizing application processes. The Canadian immigration portal has 95 out of 100 metrics digitized, and US visa applications is like 9% according to the Cato Institute. So the United States will eventually get towards a more technological approach to immigration policy, and we'll go back to being a very, even under Trump was a mass migration society. It's just that with mortality and lower fertility, you've had not an insufficient intake of people, but the United States could easily go back to taking 600,000 to 1 million new migrants every single year, which would be far larger than Canada or any other country at the turn of a hat. It could well be that in 2022, it could well be that this year, I would say, and it'll be interesting to look back in December, that 700,000 or 800,000 people migrated to the United States, which would again be more than the entire rest of the world put together. So it can turn on and off like a switch, and Trump will have just been a blip, really. And as it happens, the October census revealed that the American population under Trump did become more diverse, more mixed race, certainly more Latino. So the truth is that populist politics tends to have a far less impact on these much deeper, far deeper, human demographic and migratory patterns than we think it does.
Thanks so much.
The latest record of people, Vladimir and Paul, would you please combine the questions? I saw Kim and Matthias also, but I'm not sure they're still on the list. Vladimir, please.
Parag, thank you so much for this incredible talk. My question is about the prospective migration from South Asia and other parts of the global South to the climatically more increasingly attractive regions in the North. What needs to happen institutionally on the international level to allow this population movement over the next half century? As you rightfully pointed out, sovereignty is preciously guarded by many countries in the global North. So do you anticipate international pressure on the European Union, on Russia, on Central Asia to open up borders in the coming decades?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question that I think is best answered from the bottom up rather than the top down. The nature of your question is top down. What needs to happen at the international level? As I said, we will never have a global migration accord. You could even have Nordic countries, or you could have, let's say, Northern countries. You could have Arctic Council countries take on the issue of migration, but they wouldn't agree on how they're going to handle it. The Canadian approach, the Scandinavian approach, the British Isles, Russia, Japan, they're all going to have different policies, let's face it, right? So there will never be coordination across countries of the North merely by virtue of the fact that they happen to be located geographically in the northern latitudes of the planet. That's all they have in common in terms of their political characteristics. And so you can see already the difference between the way, Sweden versus Denmark is handling migration, or Finland and Norway. And of course, Canada being very different from Russia. And the Central Asian countries have been much more welcoming, actually, of migrants than Russia has been. And I explain in the book the difference between Kazakhstan and Russia in terms of Kazakhstan actually embracing its role as a demographic melting pot. It's been quite cautious, obviously, about the significant influx of Chinese people, but it's been very welcoming of again, other Central Asians, as by far the most dynamic economy in Central Asia and the largest geographically, and of other Asian populations as well, whereas Russia has been less so. So again, they each go in their own direction in this regard. Now they will, by necessity, where they border each other, they will have to find ways to cooperate, of course. But international pressure on migration issues tends to, as you well know, have almost no impact whatsoever, because again, countries do not, if European countries were actually willing to suspend the Schengen Agreement, you can't possibly pretend that countries with far less commitment to either the international law or their own European law, or the normative aspiration towards greater migration and the right to migration, that they would do the same. So again, this is an area where it's correct to be cynical. So I think that one has to posit to Russia, and put to Russia, and as I do in conversations in Russia itself, that this is in their best interest and that they should have a proactive strategy of assimilation. And again, I actually see positive signals on the ground. I quote specifically the Far Eastern governors and administrators who tell me that they want to see a more sensible migration policy. I actually believe it can happen without any kind of divine or supranational force compelling it.
Please, Paul and Kim Sipes.
Yes, so thanks so much for your talk. I'll try and make my question short. So I'd like to know the relationship between migration and sustainability, which you brought up, and in particular the notion that one hears a lot about sustainability. Environmental sustainability requires a sense of place, a sense of attachment. You hear this most often in indigenous cosmologies, where a sense of place is in stewardship of the land, is a responsibility which carries over generations. And so that seems to clash a bit with your idea of migration, where land is not territory, it's just space and not place. So I wanted to sort of ask you about how you see sense of place and sustainability and migration coming together.
Well, that's a great point. I mean, I would like to think actually that we would have a synthesis, amongst these perspectives in which we learn from those indigenous cosmologies and embrace, and as I do in that slide, as you saw in the book, embrace the language of stewardship. And stewardship is very much a place-based attitude, right? So, cultivating our own garden and preventing the tragedy of the commons kinds of effects that may occur as a result of significant mass migration. So stewardship is not only, though, something that is, spiritual or cultural, it ultimately comes down also to economic and technological practices. And so I think that sharing those practices and implementing those practices at a larger scale in the geographies that we seek to conserve is very, very important. Because on the one hand, you have the moral obligation and the inevitability of rising populations in these pristine geographies that are the historical, sort of location of indigenous populations that have managed either by virtue of their practices or by virtue of the fact that their populations have been small to conserve those habitats. But with a population influx, you still want to maintain that conservation. But let's face it, it's not going to happen purely through organic means as populations grow, because we have that tendency to industrialize geographies as we colonize them. And therefore, we have to bring in some of the proactive technological elements around how you do sustainable housing, how you do circular economic practices around rainwater collection and wastewater treatment and recycling and materials recycling in the built environment, hydroponic and aquaponic agriculture, and obviously battery power and solar renewable energy and these kinds of things. And all of that is going to be necessary, layered on top of ideally a consciousness that continues to permeate this future, in which we're thinking more in terms of stewardship and less in terms of sovereignty. So I'd like to think that there isn't a sort of, a dichotomy or a clash between what I'm characterizing as a sort of materially, kind of more or less irrevocable future, and the kind of the positive characteristics, of the stewardship mentality as you're describing them.
Please, Kim Sipes, and then Matthias Biddle. Please, Kim.
Okay, thank you. Parag, excellent talk. Really enjoyed it. I'm looking at things from a little different angle, in that I live in Indiana, in part of the Rust Belt in the United States. One of the things that we're seeing, of course, the U.S. differs very much from the coast versus say the upper Midwest, for example. One of the problems that we're seeing is that our economic system is not supporting the people that are here. That's why they're migrating outward to the coast, or that's at least part of that. But also the question of capitalism in climate change. I would argue that capitalism is causing climate change, and that if we're going to stop climate change, we've got to challenge the idea of capitalism. So this falls into my work with workers, and seeing in talking about globalization, both a top-down and a bottom-up globalization based on different values and things such as this. And it sounds like you're assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that you're assuming that things are going to continue as they are. I mean, one of the things we're going to see is that as the climate gets worse, we're seeing the rising of the oceans, and we're going to see migration out of the coastal cities. and you don't seem to take that on, or at least from what your talk is today. And so I'd like you to elaborate, if you would, on some of these ideas.
Sure. So in the, in the book, and actually in the slide that I had about the National Geographic series that I did around climate migration, I explicitly talk about the kind of three sort of the three kind of or sort of coastal to inland is going to be one of the biggest shifts. Right. South to north, obviously more broadly, amidst that, and from low-lying to elevated area. So those are predictable patterns, if you will, of flows. And what that means for, in a way, the fact that the urban centers, pillars of the world economy that drive our global capitalist system are actually coastal, maritime cities, whether it is New York and Los Angeles or London and so forth. So are there going to be adjustments in the geography or the locus of commercial activity? Yes, and that's something I talk about. The fact that you have high demographic growth, growing economies in whether it is Canada or elsewhere where populations are reconcentrating, that's going to be a feature over the medium to long term in terms of the centers of the world economy, so to speak. But economies are becoming more regional and localized at the same time as they introduce these practices, these sustainability practices around more local procurement in industry and even in agriculture. So places are implementing these circular practices within capitalism, you might say, and capitalisms are taking on different forms in different locations as we move away from a world of far-flung, just-in-time global supply chains towards more localized, more regionalized economies. You can see this happening in North America with the U.S.-Canada-Mexico trade agreement under the Trump administration, and this is going to be one lasting effect of the Trump administration, is that the United States trades more with Canada and trades more with Mexico each than it does with China. So North America is becoming a regional system, right? And those supply chains are restructuring and reorienting. At the same, of course, there is a rising trade deficit with China, but the overall volume of trade with China is flat. And it could well decline, especially in the aftermath of this pandemic, where a lot of the rising imports was due just to production delays and disruptions and so forth. And Europe as well is pushing very hard towards greater circularity, and its industrial policy is pushing in that direction. And the same is true of Asian countries. If you think about China and its dual circulation policy and its import substitution industrial policy, and India is doing the same. So we're not, yes, there is a global economic system, there is global capitalism, there is a global financial system as well, but there are increasingly these walled gardens, if you will, within them. And you can see this in everything from industrial production to data privacy policies, which are quite differential. So we're moving into a patchwork kind of world where whether it's capital or whether it's people, industrial activity, and the locus of those gravitates into these centers and tends to produce mostly for those centers. So you can, on the one hand, even if we didn't agree in our critique of capitalism as a driver of climate change and these forces, and we actually do happen to agree on that, we can still posit that the future outcome isn't really a global reform. It's a sort of a dissipation, dispersal into these different localized systems.
Okay, thank you.
Matthias, please.
Thank you. I sympathize, of course, a lot with all what you said. I have nevertheless two questions. One is, I would like to understand, how do you come to your figures? So there was one slide which touches a little bit in my field with history. And when you say that 75% of all migrants in the 19th century migrated for political reasons, while in the 20th century for economic and climate reasons, I wonder, where the hell have you these figures from? Yeah, so that's one. And the second is more of a conceptual question. I see two strands in migration studies. One is the push-pull fraction, always saying if you have any kind of reason to migrate, you will migrate. and you can stop that or push that a little bit back by political means. But in fact, there will be no real stop to that intention to migrate. And others calculate how many migrate even under the worst conditions. So the one strand comes to estimates of 1/3 of the population will be on the move. The other, let's say, calculating on the basis of historical experience with an outbreak of a volcano, with earthquakes, with deep economic crisis, with war, come to 1, max 3% of the population. So in fact, we have two scenarios. One is there's a majority of the people in the future on the move. The other is it will remain a very, very small minority that is in fact really mobile in the sense not going to the city center.
Right.
Germany was confronted in the early 1990s with the expectation that between 50 and 80 million Russians will come out of 180 million Russians. Yeah. Of course, they never came. So this push-pull fraction in the social sciences goes very much together with this kind of sovereignty panics we see among populists in governments, etc. Recently in Germany, we got a net income of migrants from less than 100,000. Yeah, because millions and millions of people went back to their countries of origin because they tried to attract their own population due to the demographic scenarios. So how do you decide on which material basis when it comes to data, you decide for which narrative?
Excellent. Okay, let me take this in reverse order. First of all movement, whether it is away from home towards a destination country or returning from a destination country, is part of my story, right? It isn't really a unidirectional story of them coming to us. And as economies rise and outperform, they have often drawn back members of their own diaspora. I've actually looked at this over decades when the Turkish economy has been on a positive trajectory, and when there's been a perception that Turkey is, sort of on the make in terms of stability and industrial growth. Turks have left Europe and gone back to Turkey, for example. The US-Mexico migration has been in recent years net zero, because many Mexicans and Mexican Americans have gone back to Mexico to take advantage of lower cost of living and dynamic commercial, opportunities. But that too constitutes migration. During the pandemic, the largest movement of people at all was South Asian construction workers, guest workers leaving the Gulf to go back to India. And what I write about in National Geographic is quite a few of them going back to villages where they became farmers, because the agricultural sector has been high growing in certain provinces of India. So by no means do I take a Western centric narrative of them coming to us as the only vector that matters. It's all mobility in all circulatory directions that matters to me, actually, even if that means people going home. And it could well be that people don't ever leave their country. One of the things I say at the very beginning of the book is that, yes, we have about 8 billion people in the world, and we do have an optimization sort of problem, if you will, to speak about it in a strictly kind of material terms. But the vast majority of human beings have never left the country in which they were born, and that will probably continue to be true. And most Brazilians will never leave Brazil, most Indians will never leave India, most Africans will never leave their home nation, and most Chinese will never leave China. So I focus, therefore, on, rather than a particular geography, on the demographic segment, which is to say young people, wherever they may be, because they are most capable of migration, have the greatest proclivity to migration, are making the greatest efforts at migration. If you look at young Latinos, if you look at young Africans, Eritreans, Ethiopians, if you look at young Indians, what do you see? They are the ones who represent today's and tomorrow's mobile, obviously Arab refugees into Europe and so on. So I'm focusing on young people, not because they represent 75% of the human population and that, billions of people will move, but it's this particular set of 1 or 2 billion people across nationalities and geographies that will be moving. So there isn't a contradiction there at all.
Only ask, how do you come to this 1 to 2 billion? I mean, the current calculations say it is 3% of the world's population, but you come obviously to 20.
These are different different issues that we're talking about entirely.
Okay.
The fact that 3% of today's human population is defined as being the migrant stock of the world, 250 to 275 million people today, which is 3% of today's population. First of all, I disagree with using that particular metric, in other words, using percentage as a unit to characterize this issue, because the world population quadrupled. It is the worst statistical sleight of hand to minimize the issue of migration, to simply say, oh, look, it's steady, it's 3% of the world population, and it was even higher a century ago. The world population was less than 1/4 of what it is today. So this is an issue where we should be talking about absolute numbers, not percentages, because the fact that we're talking about close to 300 million people is a much bigger deal than if we're talking about merely 15 or 20 million people. And that distinction is entirely erased when we simply say that, oh, well, it's still about 3% of the world population, so no big deal, because it is a big deal numerically. And this is an area where the number matters a lot more than the percentage. Secondly, I don't conclude that there will be, 1 or 2 billion people crossing borders. I talk about, and one very important thing about migration, and I could have said this up front, I certainly do in the book, but international migration is not the barometer of migration, right? Most human migration is, of course, internal migration, and the change in one's material circumstances can be as or more significant while remaining within the borders of one's country without ever having to migrate internationally. The fact that we have a bias in our literature towards international migration as something that we more easily measure, and that again reflects, of course, our cultural focus on ourselves, because they are coming to us. We don't, when Mexicans move within Mexico and Chinese move within China, of course, the largest mass migration in history is not recorded in any international statistics because it's simply Chinese within China. But that has been one of the most seismic events in the international political economy, has been the consequences of Chinese moving within their own country. Has been the greatest earthquake in the world economy perhaps ever. So by no means do I take a domestic or international only bias. Only in this conversation I have, and I try not to be Eurocentric. In terms of your very important point about, again, the characterizing the drivers in these neat categories of political, economic, colonial, as I said at the, very, very transparently during my talk, I don't believe that these distinctions can really be made in a meaningful way, right? I don't think that you can just like if you look at today's Syrian civil war, the Syrian refugee wave, we know that climate played a role in the political unrest, in the economic failure, in the migrant wave, right? So, I embrace that complexity rather than attempting to say, well, this was a climate migration versus this was a political migration. And the same is, of course, true if you want to look at the deprivation in Italy, and the economic hardship and the agricultural failures, whether it's Ireland to Italy in the 19th century. Are we really going to tease these out and say this was political and this was economic, or whether it's obviously 19th century European revolutions, whether it is European population movements, the tens of millions in both centuries, 18th and 19th centuries, tens of millions of Europeans moving to America. How many of them came for economic reasons versus political reasons, and whatnot. I'm not actually attempting to create a hard and fast typology by any means. I would characterize that effort, as bunk, but I do look at the trigger events in each century. I actually have a whole set of slides that go kind of point by point. I'm very happy to send them to you, and please do correct them if you feel that I've taken an event and characterized it as, say World War II, and I say, look, this is a political event. Let's look at the number of refugees that emerged from the European theater of conflict in World War II, and let's add that to this side of the ledger and tally and add it up. But of course, we're talking about very rough numbers and very vague associations, and I don't even want to indulge, because I agree with you that that would be a fool's errand. But the overall number is not really in dispute in terms of the growth in the aggregate number of migrants, international migrants, in each successive century. That's the much larger point.
Thanks everybody for all your participation and your questions, and Happy New Year. And Parag, thank you so much for joining us in your early hour. Thanks very much. What a pleasure, this opening of the colloquium. Thanks much.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, and there are also comments from other colleagues like Richard Falk, who cannot join now, but he wants to connect on video later on. Thanks a lot, Parag. Thanks, everybody. Please.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Thanks, everybody. Parag, wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Happy New Year.
All right.